The sun was setting as Robert Henderson drove his black sedan through the quiet streets of Oak Ridge Heights. The neighborhood's large homes with perfectly manicured lawns looked peaceful in the golden evening light. Robert had just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to getting home, changing into comfortable clothes, and maybe catching the basketball game on TV. He noticed the police cruiser in his rearview mirror before the flashing lights came on. With a sigh, he signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, making sure to do everything by the book. Years of experience had taught him the unwritten rules of being a black man behind the wheel. License and registration, the officer demanded, not bothering with a greeting. His partner stood on the passenger side, hand resting casually near his holster. "Good evening, officer," Robert said politely, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" "You were doing 45 in a 35, the officer replied, his tone sharp. "License and registration now." Robert moved slowly, narrating his actions. "I'm reaching for my wallet in my inside jacket pocket, and then I'll get the registration from the glove compartment." As he handed over his documents, he noticed the officers exchanging glances at the address on his license, not from this neighborhood, and at the luxury car he was driving. "This your car?" the second officer asked, leaning down to peer through the passenger window. "Yes, sir. I've owned it for about 3 years now." The first officer looked at the license, then at Robert, then back at the license. "Step out of the vehicle, please." "May I ask why?" "I don't believe I've done anything wrong." "We've had reports of a similar vehicle involved in drug trafficking. We're going to need to search the car." Robert felt his heart rate pick up, but kept his voice steady. "Officer, I don't consent to a search. I was simply driving home from work, and I don't believe you have probable cause for a search." The atmosphere changed instantly. The officer's face hardened. "Look, buddy, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Get out of the car now." "I understand you're doing your job, but I know my rights," Robert insisted, still calm but firm. "Unless you have a warrant or probable cause, I don't consent to a search." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The officer yanked open the driver's door, grabbed Robert's arm, and pulled him from the car. Before he could even regain his balance, Robert found himself pushed against the side of his own vehicle, his cheek pressed against the cool metal. "Stop resisting," the officer shouted, though Robert hadn't moved a muscle. "I'm not resisting," he replied, his voice muffled against the car. The cold metal of handcuffs clicked around his wrists as the second officer began rifling through his car. Robert watched helplessly as his briefcase was opened, papers scattered across the seat. "What's this? You some kind of lawyer?" the officer asked mockingly, holding up a legal document. "I work in law, yes," Robert replied, trying to maintain his dignity despite being handcuffed on the side of the road where anyone driving by could see him. "Well, Mr. Lawyer, you're under arrest for resisting arrest and obstruction of justice." As they placed him in the back of the police cruiser, Robert caught sight of his reflection in the window. His tie was crooked, his suit jacket wrinkled. He took a deep breath, knowing that the night ahead would be long, but also knowing that this wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Robert sat on the hard bench in the holding cell. He'd been there all night, watching the clock on the wall tick by painfully slowly. His suit, which had been crisp and professional yesterday morning, was now wrinkled and carried the smell of the cell, a mix of disinfectant and despair. "Henderson," called an officer finally. "Your bail's been posted." Walking through the station, Robert felt the stares, some curious, some dismissive. The processing officer pushed a plastic bag across the counter. "Your personal effects. Sign here." Inside were his wallet, watch, tie clip, and phone, now dead after a night without charging. His wedding ring felt cold as he slipped it back onto his finger. "What about my car?" Robert asked. "Impounded," the officer replied without looking up. "You'll need to pay the fees to get it released. Here's the paperwork for your court date. Don't miss it." Outside, the morning sun was harsh on his tired eyes. Lisa, his wife, waited in their other car, worry etched across her face. She jumped out as soon as she saw him. "Robert, are you okay? What happened?" Her arms wrapped around him, and for the first time since the ordeal began, he allowed himself to feel the weight of it all. "I'm okay," he assured her, though they both knew it wasn't true. Not really. The drive home was quiet at first. Then, piece by piece, he told her everything. The stop, the accusations, the humiliation of being handcuffed on the side of the road. They said I was resisting, he said, shaking his head. I was standing still. At home, Robert showered, trying to wash away the night. The hot water couldn't erase the feeling of those handcuffs or the sound of the cell door clanging shut. He dressed in fresh clothes, made coffee, and called his office. Department of Justice, how may I direct your call? This is Robert Henderson. I need to speak with Tom in the administrative office, please. After explaining that he wouldn't be in today, a personal emergency, Robert sat at his kitchen table, staring at the charges on the paperwork. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues wondering where he was. News traveled fast in the office. By noon, his supervisor had called. Robert, I heard what happened. This is outrageous. I know, Robert replied, his voice steady despite the anger and hurt swirling inside him. They're saying I resisted arrest and obstructed justice, for asking why I was being pulled over, for knowing my rights. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What are you going to do? The district attorney's office had already reached out through an intermediary. They'd offered a deal, plead guilty to a lesser charge of disorderly conduct, pay a fine, and this would all go away. No jail time. Clean record afterward. The easy way out. Looking at the family photos on his wall, his parents at their anniversary, his college graduation, his wedding day, Robert thought about all the people who didn't have the advantages he had, who couldn't afford bail, who didn't have colleagues calling to check on them, who would take the plea because fighting seemed impossible. I'm going to fight it, he told his supervisor, all the way. Lisa sat down beside him, sliding a sandwich in front of him. Eat something. You need your strength. This isn't just about me, Robert said, taking her hand. If they can do this to me, a lawyer who knows his rights, what happens to everyone else? What happens to the kids who don't know what to say when an officer demands to search their car without cause? Lisa squeezed his hand. So what's next? Robert pulled out a notepad. I document everything, every detail I can remember. Then I find the best criminal defense attorney in the city. He looked up at her, determination replacing the exhaustion in his eyes. And then we show them exactly who they decided to mess with. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Robert sat across from Patricia Wilson, one of the city's top defense attorneys, in her downtown office. The wall behind her desk was lined with law books and framed certificates. She listened intently as he recounted his story for what felt like the 100th time. So let me get this straight, Patricia said, tapping her pen against her notepad. They claimed you were speeding, but never showed you radar evidence. They wanted to search your car with no probable cause. And when you respectfully declined, they arrested you for resisting, even though their own dashcam would show you standing still with your hands visible. Robert nodded. That's exactly what happened. Patricia leaned back in her chair. Have you requested the dashcam footage yet? I filed the request the day after it happened. They're dragging their feet on releasing it. They always do, Patricia sighed. We'll subpoena it. What about witnesses? Robert pulled out his phone. There was a woman walking her dog across the street. She stopped to watch what was happening. I saw her recording with her phone. He showed Patricia a social media post he'd found where someone described witnessing a black man being roughly arrested in Oak Ridge Heights. I think this is her. Patricia smiled for the first time. Good detective work. We'll reach out. Meanwhile, across town, Officers Daniels and Reynolds sat in a meeting with the department's attorney. The police report in front of them detailed a very different version of events. A belligerent driver, clear signs of nervousness, aggressive movements that justified their response. Your stories match, the attorney said, reviewing their statements. But we need to be prepared for the dashcam footage to be entered as evidence. The camera angle doesn't show everything, Officer Daniels insisted. It doesn't show how he was reaching toward the glove compartment in a threatening manner, or how he tensed up when we tried to remove him from the vehicle, added Reynolds. That's resisting. The attorney nodded. The department stands behind you. The DA is confident we have a solid case. Back at home, Robert spread documents across his dining room table. Lisa brought him a cup of coffee and peered over his shoulder. What's all this? Police training manuals, department policies on traffic stops. I'm finding all the ways they violated protocol. Robert rubbed his tired eyes. Did you know officers are specifically trained not to escalate situations like mine? There's an entire section on de-escalation techniques they're supposed to use. Lisa sat down beside him. Will it be enough? It has to be, Robert replied. The DA offered another plea deal today, still trying to make this go away quietly. And you turned it down? Robert nodded. They don't know who they're dealing with yet. The next morning, Robert met with Patricia again, this time bringing a thick folder of notes and research. I pulled every case in this district where the charges included resisting arrest, he explained, opening the folder. Look at the pattern. 70% of these cases involve Black or Hispanic defendants. Nearly half were eventually dismissed, but only after the defendants spent thousands on legal fees or took plea deals. Patricia flipped through the pages, impressed. You'd make a good defense attorney, you know. Robert smiled slightly. I prefer my side of the courtroom. As the court date approached, Robert rehearsed his testimony in his living room, with Lisa playing the role of the prosecutor. And why did you refuse the search, Mr. Henderson? She asked, mimicking an aggressive tone. Because the Fourth Amendment protects citizens against unreasonable searches. The officers had no probable cause, no warrant, and I exercised my constitutional right to refuse. The night before the trial, Robert stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie. The face looking back at him showed the strain of the past weeks, the sleepless nights, the anxiety, the anger he'd been carefully channeling into preparation. Ready? Liz asked, appearing in the doorway. Robert took a deep breath. As ready as I'll ever be. Tomorrow, the truth comes out. The courthouse steps were crowded with people rushing in different directions. Robert straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and walked through the imposing doors with Patricia by his side. Lisa had offered to come, but he'd asked her to stay home. He didn't want her to have to sit through the officer's testimony. Inside the courtroom, the polished wooden benches gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Robert's footsteps echoed as he made his way to the defense table. Across the aisle, a young assistant district attorney arranged papers, occasionally glancing in Robert's direction with a mixture of curiosity and confidence. All rise, called the bailiff as Judge Howard Wilson entered. A slim man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and glasses perched on the end of his nose, the judge had a reputation for running a tight courtroom. Be seated, Judge Wilson instructed, shuffling through papers. Case number 2357, State v. Henderson. Charges of resisting arrest and obstruction of justice. He peered over his glasses. How does the defendant plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Robert replied clearly. Very well. Opening statements. The prosecutor, a woman named Claire Thomas, rose from her seat. Her navy suit was crisp, her voice confident as she addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is quite simple. The defendant was pulled over for speeding. When asked to exit his vehicle for a routine search, he became uncooperative. When officers attempted to maintain control of the situation, he resisted. Our law enforcement officers put their lives on the line every day to keep our streets safe. They deserve our respect and cooperation, not obstruction. Robert watched the jurors' faces as she spoke. Several nodded along. He felt a knot form in his stomach. Patricia's opening was equally concise. This case isn't about disrespecting police. It's about protecting the constitutional rights of every citizen. My client wasn't just cooperative, he was exemplary in his conduct. The evidence will show that these officers escalated a routine traffic stop unnecessarily and violated my client's Fourth Amendment rights. The prosecution called Officer Daniels first. He walked to the stand in his pressed uniform, badge gleaming. After being sworn in, he described the events with rehearsed precision. We observed the vehicle traveling at approximately 45 miles per hour in a 35 zone. We initiated a traffic stop, and the driver immediately began questioning our authority. And how did he question your authority? Claire asked. He asked why he was being pulled over in a confrontational tone. When informed of the speed violation, he denied it. His body language was tense, defensive. Based on my training and experience, these are indicators of potential criminal activity. Robert wrote notes furiously as Officer Daniels continued, painting him as increasingly belligerent and uncooperative. We then noticed the vehicle matched the description of one recently reported in connection with drug trafficking in the area. Robert's head snapped up. This was new. It hadn't been in any of the reports. At that point, we requested to search the vehicle. The defendant became agitated, refusing to comply with lawful orders. And what happened next? Claire prompted. The defendant made a sudden movement toward the glove compartment area. Fearing for our safety, we removed him from the vehicle. He tensed his body and pulled away. Classic resistance behaviors. Patricia raised objection after objection, speculation, facts not in evidence, but Judge Wilson overruled most of them. The officer is explaining his perception of events based on his training and experience, the judge stated firmly. Officer Reynolds' testimony followed the same narrative with almost identical wording. The choreographed nature of their testimonies was obvious to Robert, but the jury seemed impressed by their professionalism and certainty. During a brief recess, Robert leaned toward Patricia. They're lying about the drug trafficking vehicle. That was never mentioned during the stop. I know, Patricia replied quietly, but it's their word against yours right now. The judge is giving them a lot of latitude. Robert watched Judge Wilson chatting amicably with the prosecutor. The casual familiarity between them was unmistakable. He's not even trying to hide his bias, Robert whispered. Patricia gave him a knowing look. Welcome to reality for most defendants. The system assumes officers are telling the truth. She squeezed his arm reassuringly. But we have something they don't know about yet. The dashcam footage? Patricia nodded. They'd finally released it this morning. We'll see how their stories hold up when the jury sees what really happened. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall courtroom windows as Patricia rose for cross-examination. The spectators who had been nodding off after lunch suddenly sat up straighter, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Officer Daniels, Patricia began, her voice friendly but firm. You testified that my client was speeding, going 45 in a 35 zone. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am. Did you use radar to determine his speed? Officer Daniels shifted slightly. No, I used my visual estimation based on my training. I see. And this training allows you to determine exact speeds just by looking. Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative, the prosecutor called out. Sustained, Judge Wilson replied quickly. Patricia nodded, unperturbed. You also testified that Mr. Henderson's vehicle matched the description of one connected to drug trafficking. Could you share what specific information you had about this vehicle? Officer Daniels glanced toward the prosecutor before answering. We had received information about a black sedan being used for drug transportation in that area. A black sedan, Patricia repeated. Like thousands of others in this city, did you have a license plate number? A make and model? Not specifically, no. Did you find any drugs in Mr. Henderson's car? No. Any evidence of criminal activity whatsoever? No, but... Thank you, officer. Patricia cut him off politely before he could add anything. She walked to the defense table and picked up a tablet. Your Honor, the defense would like to introduce Exhibit C, the dashcam footage from the officer's vehicle on the night in question. The prosecutor jumped up. Your Honor, we object to this evidence. The defense didn't provide proper notice. Actually, Patricia countered, we submitted our request for this footage weeks ago. It was only released to us this morning, despite our repeated requests. We provided it to the prosecution as soon as we received it. Judge Wilson frowned, looking less certain than he had all day. I'll allow it. Proceed. A screen was set up, and the courtroom lights dimmed slightly. Robert watched the jurors' faces as the footage began to play. It showed exactly what he remembered. His car pulling over promptly, the officers approaching, their increasingly aggressive tone, as he politely asked questions and explained his rights. Most damning of all, when the officers claimed Robert had made a sudden movement toward the glove compartment, the video clearly showed his hands remained on the steering wheel the entire time. When they said he had resisted being removed from the car, the footage showed him standing calmly until he was suddenly yanked out of frame. Even the audio contradicted their testimony. Nowhere did they mention anything about drug trafficking or matching vehicle descriptions during the actual stop. As the lights came back up, the jury exchanged glances. Several were openly frowning. Officer Daniels, Patricia continued, "Would you like to revise any of your earlier testimony in light of this footage?" "The camera doesn't show everything," he insisted, though his confidence had visibly diminished. "The angle. The angle clearly shows my client's hands never left the steering wheel when you claimed he was reaching for the glove compartment, doesn't it?" Officer Daniels' face reddened. "From that particular angle, yes." By the time Patricia finished with both officers, their carefully constructed narrative had crumbled. The woman who had recorded the incident on her phone testified next, describing how she'd been walking her dog when she saw two officers pulling a well-dressed man from his car. "He wasn't fighting them at all," she said firmly. "He kept saying, 'I'm not resisting,' while they pushed him against the car." After the witness stepped down, Judge Wilson checked his watch. "We'll recess for today and resume tomorrow morning." As the courtroom began to clear, Robert noticed the prosecutor in deep conversation with her team, their expressions concerned. Judge Wilson's earlier friendliness toward them had cooled noticeably. "That went well," Patricia said quietly as they gathered their materials. "The dashcam footage was even clearer than I hoped." "So what happens tomorrow?" Robert asked. "Tomorrow," Patricia replied with a small smile, "you take the stand. And that's when they'll learn exactly who they've been dealing with." The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the dashcam footage, and now curious onlookers filled the back rows. Robert adjusted his tie and took slow, deep breaths as Patricia reviewed her notes one last time. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly. Robert nodded. "More than ready." Judge Wilson called the court to order. "The defense may call its first witness." Patricia stood. "The defense calls Robert Henderson to the stand." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Robert walked to the witness box. After being sworn in, he sat down, his posture straight but relaxed. "Mr. Henderson," Patricia began, "could you please tell the court about your educational background?" The prosecutor frowned, clearly wondering about the relevance, but didn't object. "I graduated from Howard University with honors," Robert replied. "Then I attended Yale Law School, where I was an editor of the Law Review." "And your current occupation?" Robert's voice was calm and clear. "I am an assistant United States attorney for the Department of Justice." The courtroom fell silent for a moment, then erupted in whispers. Judge Wilson's eyebrows shot up, and he banged his gavel. "Order." The prosecutor's face had gone pale. The two officers exchanged worried glances. Judge Wilson leaned forward. "Did you say United States attorney?" "Yes, Your Honor," Robert confirmed. "I've been with the DOJ for the past 8 years, specializing in civil rights cases." The judge's entire demeanor transformed. His previously dismissive expression was replaced with something between respect and concern. "Please continue," he said to Patricia, his voice noticeably softer. Patricia nodded. "Mr. Henderson, could you please describe what happened on the night of April 15th? Robert recounted the events exactly as they had occurred. The traffic stop, his polite questions, the officer's escalating aggression, and his eventual arrest. His training as a prosecutor was evident in his clear factual testimony. "At any point during this interaction, did you reach for the glove compartment?" Patricia asked. "No. My hands remained on the steering wheel until I was forcibly removed from the vehicle." "And did the officers mention anything about drug trafficking or your car matching a description?" "No, that was never mentioned during the stop." That claim appeared for the first time in their written report. As Patricia finished her questioning, the prosecutor approached for cross-examination. Her earlier confidence had evaporated. "Mr. Henderson," she began hesitantly, "why didn't you identify yourself as a federal prosecutor during the traffic stop?" Robert looked her directly in the eye. "Because in that moment, I wasn't a federal prosecutor. I was just another black man being profiled and mistreated by law enforcement. My professional position shouldn't matter when it comes to basic rights and dignity." The prosecutor had no further questions. Judge Wilson cleared his throat. "The court will take a 30-minute recess." He beckoned both attorneys to approach the bench before leaving the courtroom. In the hallway, Robert spotted Officer Daniels and Officer Reynolds huddled with their department attorney, their faces grim. People who had been watching the trial were pointing in his direction, whispering. Patricia emerged from the judge's chambers, a satisfied smile on her face. "What happened?" Robert asked. "The judge wants to speak with you privately," she replied. and the prosecutor is suddenly very interested in discussing a dismissal. Inside the judge's chambers, Judge Wilson had removed his robes. He looked smaller somehow, more ordinary. "Mr. Henderson," he began awkwardly, "this is a most unfortunate situation. Had I known your position—" "That's precisely the problem, Your Honor," Robert interrupted politely. "My position shouldn't matter. Every citizen deserves the same respect and protection under the law." The judge nodded uncomfortably. Of course. I've spoken with the district attorney. They're prepared to dismiss all charges immediately." "I appreciate that," Robert said, "but I want the dismissal on record with a finding that the officers violated my constitutional rights." Judge Wilson hesitated. "That would open the department to liability." "Yes," Robert agreed, "it would. And it should." The judge studied him for a long moment. "You know, most people in your position would just be happy to have the charges dropped." Robert met his gaze steadily. "Most people in my position shouldn't have been in this position in the first place." The courtroom was silent as Judge Wilson read his decision. "The court finds that the officers involved in this case acted without proper cause and violated the defendant's constitutional rights. All charges against Mr. Henderson are hereby dismissed with prejudice." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Robert closed his eyes briefly, exhaling the breath he'd been holding. Lisa squeezed his hand under the table. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of reporters had gathered. Word had spread quickly about a federal prosecutor who had been profiled and wrongfully arrested. Camera flashes popped as Robert emerged with Patricia and Lisa. "Mr. Henderson, will you be filing a lawsuit against the police department?" one reporter called out. "I'm not focused on a lawsuit," Robert replied. "I'm focused on change. What happened to me happens to people across this country every day. The difference is, I had the resources and knowledge to fight back. Many don't." In the days that followed, Robert's case became a headline in local news, then national. His phone rang constantly with interview requests. Fellow attorneys reached out with their own stories of being profiled despite their credentials. More importantly, everyday people contacted him to share similar experiences. 2 weeks after the dismissal, Robert sat in the office of Chief Thomas Brown of the police department. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Those officers have been suspended pending an internal investigation," the chief said, his expression carefully neutral. "I want you to know we take these matters very seriously." "I appreciate that," Robert replied. "But I'm not here about those 2 officers specifically. I'm here about training and accountability across the board." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a detailed proposal for revised training protocols, civilian oversight, and body camera policies. "I've been working on this for the past 2 weeks," Robert explained. "These changes would bring your department in line with best practices nationally." The chief flipped through the pages with a frown. "This would require significant resources." "So does defending lawsuits," Robert countered. "I'm offering to work with your department on implementation. I'd rather build bridges than burn them." A month later, Robert stood at a podium in a community center. The room was packed with people from all walks of life, community leaders, police officers, regular citizens concerned about police-community relations. "What happened to me wasn't unique," Robert began. "But my response can be. I could have simply accepted the dismissal of charges and moved on. I could have filed a lawsuit and sought financial compensation. Instead, I chose to use this experience as a catalyst for change." He outlined the new training program being implemented at the police department, the civilian review board being established, and the policy changes designed to prevent similar incidents. "This isn't about vilifying police officers," he continued. "It's about creating a system that works for everyone, one that protects citizens' rights while allowing officers to do their jobs effectively." In the front row, Lisa watched with pride. Beside her sat the woman who had recorded the incident on her phone, now a vocal advocate for police accountability. After the presentation, a young black law student approached Robert. "You've inspired me," he said. "I was considering corporate law, but now I'm thinking about civil rights work." Robert smiled. "We need good people in that field." As they drove home that evening, Lisa turned to him. "You know, most people would have just been happy to have the charges dropped. They wouldn't have pushed for all these changes." Robert watched the city lights pass by outside the window. When I was sitting in that cell, I kept thinking about all the people who don't have a law degree, who don't know their rights, who can't fight back the way I could. If I didn't use this opportunity to try to fix the system, what was the point of all my education and position? He thought about the changes already taking place, the new training programs, the community dialogues, the increased scrutiny on police practices. It wasn't perfect, and there was still so much work to do, but it was a start. Sometimes, he said quietly, the most important cases are the ones that never make it to court.